Good evening and welcome to another episode of Grains of Wisdom, an online webinar in which we will be having insightful conversation and talking all things Irish whiskey with Powerscourt Distillery's Master Distiller and Blender, Mr. Noel Sweeney. My name is Caroline Gardner, I'm Marketing Manager here, and I'll be your host this evening. So I hope you're all keeping well after another week out there. We just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the main content of the webinar. So again, you'll have noticed when you logged on this evening, we've had a huge reaction to our webinar and lots more registrations. So you are on mute and the video is off. If you wish to engage, and please do, please use the chat function and we'd be delighted to put any of your questions to Noel. So the format for those of you joining us this week for the first time is an introduction by myself. We'll hand over to Noel. Our topic this week is fermentation, and I know Noel has a really in-depth presentation to bring us through there, so lots for everybody. And that lasts about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll get into the questions and have a Q&A piece, which will be another 10, 15 minutes. So about 30 minutes in duration. So I hope you all have your glasses topped up and ready to go. We're going to hand you over to Mr. Noel Sweeney.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar tonight on fermentation. I'm going to start our webinar with a very small, short video, which will show you some of the fermentation process. On the screen at the moment, you can see two jars. One on the left is our wort. Now, this is the sugar solution that we produced from our mash tun. And on the right, after fermentation, once fermentation is completed, we end up with a beer. And this would typically contain about 8 to 9% alcohol. At the bottom of the jar, you can see it's kind of creamy looking, and that's the yeast. We've added yeast to the wort to give us our fermentation, and the yeast precipitates a little bit at the end of fermentation. So on the next slide, part of the video, we can see how the fermentation is physically bubbling away there quite vigorously. There's a lot of activity caused by the yeast, and this is carbon dioxide that's been driven off by the fermentation process. In the next part of the video, we can see the fermentation when it's just about starting off, and here you can see how vigorous the yeast is actually creating a kind of a vortex there of activity. And we don't use any stirrers here. This is totally down to the yeast creating bubbles and bubbles creating this kind of movement, and we don't need to stir it. So if we go back to the final picture of that video, we can see again the beer and the wort, and this is basically the whole process of fermentation. So the next part of the presentation this evening, we're going to go through a slideshow, and the slides will help me to explain to you the various aspects of what's important about fermentation. So on our first slide, we're going to look at our vessels in the distillery in Powerscourt. On the left-hand side, you can see there are two larger fermentation vessels, and these are about 25,000 litres in capacity. And underneath them, or to the front of them, we have two, and there's a lagging of wood around those. That is, I'm afraid to say, not technical, it's for aesthetics. It makes them look nice, I think. But anyway, if you look at the cutout that I've arranged here, you can see the little dimple part of the vessel. So this is a cooling jacket, and the dimples are actually the wells onto the stainless steel side of the vessel, and water is passed through the dimples, and that's how we cool the fermentation, because one of the most important parts of the fermentation is keeping the yeast alive and healthy, and to do that we need to make sure that it doesn't get too hot during fermentation. So the next slide we're going to look at is yeast. Yeast, as I say, is one of the more important ingredients. We've only got the 4 ingredients, as I mentioned in the first webinar. Yeast is the one that converts our sugar solution into alcohol. On the picture on the side on the left, you can see yeast cells. Each one of those globules are yeast cells, but the interesting one here is the one on the top left. This small little bulb is actually what we call a node, or and it's a bud. And the bud is how the yeast cells during fermentation reproduce. So the bud will eventually get big enough and pop off as an independent yeast cell. The one on the bottom right is an electron microscope picture of yeast, and you can see the buds on this yeast cell very clearly. And so it will reproduce quite quickly, and that is important to us because we need that in the fermentation. So the yeast that we're looking at is called not commonly known as baker's yeast, but the Latin version of that is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So on the next slide, we're going to look at is the anatomy of this cell. And I mean, this is quite technical and quite detailed, but this is blown up again. If you look to the top right-hand side of that screen, you see it says 1 micrometer. That's 1/1,000,000th of a meter. That's that little section is. So if you compare that to the yeast cell, these are very, very tiny, but they're single cell organisms, and they will consume our sugar. And these are the bits and pieces, a bit like the intestines, or a good MRI scan of the actual yeast cell. And it's quite complex, and these are what we call, I refer to them as they're like humans, they're animals, they're not necessarily a plant. Some call them fungus, but in actual fact, they operate in similar ways to a normal person would. They eat the sugar and produce carbon dioxide and alcohol. On the next slide, we're going to look at is what are important aspects in fermentation. So the first thing that we need to make sure we do is get this temperature thing right. So when we're mashing, and the mashing process is producing our sugar, the wort will come out of the mash tun at as high as 65 degrees and up to about 70, 80 degrees centigrade. So the first thing we do is cool that down, and typically we will cool it down to about 26, 27 degrees centigrade. And that's important because yeast, when we add it, it will start to grow, and then it will start to ferment. And in doing that, it gives off energy, and that energy will increase the temperature. So you don't want to start off at the, say 30 degrees or 32, because all of a sudden you find that you're at 35 degrees in fermentation and you can't control it, and the yeast will die. So you start lower, you gradually get the yeast to wake up and start fermenting. Now, the yeast can survive up to 37 degrees, but it's under stress, and you don't want to have your yeast under stress because it does all kinds of funny things, and it doesn't like that. So we want to optimize the temperature at which fermentation happens. And as I mentioned, as it works and it gets vigorous, we find that it gives off more and more heat. And that's why those cooling jackets we pointed out earlier are very important. So we can control those with a thermometer that's in the vessel. And as the temperature rises up to about 30 degrees, the cold water comes on, and you find that it will continue to rise for a little while, as it takes a while for that cooling effect to bring down the temperature. And then it will turn off when it gets to about 29 degrees. So you have that kind of increase, decrease, and it just maintains the temperature within 28 to 32 degrees centigrade. So the yeast, of course, is growing during that period of fermentation. And there are some other issues that we're going to look at in the next slide on what are the problems with yeast and what happens during fermentation. So these are what we call the stress factors. As the yeast is very happy fermenting away, the one thing you don't want to have are issues that are going to cause problems in fermentation. So on the left-hand side, we have what we call the non-microbial factors. And these are the kind of things like salts, temperature, and the other nutrition stress. So the salts like sulfate ions, and sodium, if they're not at the right levels, you're going to have issues in your fermentation. So you need to know your water chemistry before you start. And that's, we've mentioned in the ingredient side of things, how that is important. Temperature, we've already mentioned, it's important to control that. So the temperature goes up or goes down, it affects how the yeast will react and what it's going to produce. And the other one then is the nutrient stress. There's an interesting word there, osmotic stress. So if your concentration of sugar is too high, you don't get this transition of water across the membranes and vice versa with the sugar. So it doesn't work, and the yeast will stop working. So you have to get the right sugar levels. And if the yeast or the sugar level is too weak, you'll just have another problem that you don't get enough fermentation efficiency out of the whole thing. On the other side, then the microbial factors, the very top one there is probably the most important one, the lactic acid. Lactic acid is produced by a bacteria. So, and this bacteria, what it does when it gets into your fermentation, it will eat away at all your sugar and it reduces your efficiency, something shocking, or your yield, I should say. But they also kill the yeast if lactic acid increases. And again, you don't want these things in your beer and in your in your distillation, because it just gives you a bad taste and flavor. Acetic acid, another one of these things that can cause an issue, and ethanol. Uh, you might can say, well, isn't that what we're trying to make? Of course it is. But if the alcohol content is going to get too high, the yeast will not like it. It just it gets it, you know, ethanol is a sterilant, and we're all familiar nowadays with using these alcohol sanitizers and gels to kill bacteria. Similarly, if the ethanol content gets too high, it will affect the yeast. So the normal ethanol content in a beer would anywhere between 8 to 15% alcohol. Above that is very unusual in most distilleries. Finally, pH, another one. It's not as big an issue in malt fermentations because the malt itself has a kind of buffering effect and it kind of keeps the pH constant. So it's not a big thing that you have to worry about in a malt distillery, but in other distilleries and other uses, it is important to get that right. And there's an interesting fact at the bottom. If you have all of these conditions correct, and ultimately you have a yeast cell that's quite happy, you can just imagine that it will actually split, the yeast cell can split the same weight of glucose as itself, which is 2 million molecules, into alcohol and carbon dioxide in 1 second. That's some achievement. I wish everybody was as productive as that. Anyway, we move on to the next slide. And this gives you the kind of environments in which alcohol or the yeast operates. So when we start fermentation, we've got a certain amount of oxygen inherent in the actual wort from the mashing process. And that oxygen is enough to allow the yeast that we put into the fermenter to multiply and grow. Now, the yeast will only grow in the way that we want it to grow in an aerobic situation. And aerobic means if there's oxygen there present in the wort. So the glucose molecule, you can see, it changes and produces energy and carbon dioxide. But that energy is put into the reproduction cycle and it produces a yeast. When the oxygen is used up, it then changes into fermentation mode on the right. So your glucose molecule now is diverted across into acid aldehyde, and acid aldehyde is one of these congeners that you find in the whiskey distillation, some of it, not an awful lot, but some of it. And that can be converted then by the yeast into 2 units of ethanol and 2 units of carbon dioxide. And this is what fermentation, this is how the fermentation cycle works. On our next slide, we are going to see the different forms that we can get yeast in. Now, traditionally, you could just take your baker's yeast, and I mean in the start of production of whiskey and other beers and stuff like that, if you were short of yeast in a distillery, you just nipped over to the local bakery and picked up the baker's yeast that he was using, and he was creating every day for baking bread. And as I mentioned earlier, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that's the way it would come. But these then are put into what we call a cream. It's like a suspension of yeast, and that's what yeast creams are. And the yeast cream can be delivered nowadays in tanker loads under refrigeration conditions. Now, you can't freeze it. If you take the temperature below 4 degrees, ice crystals will form, and that will kill the yeast because it penetrates the yeast walls and bursts them, and you don't want that. So you have to keep it chilled, but not ice. The next yeast that we're looking at there is what we call pressed yeast. And this is where we've taken out a certain amount of the moisture by squeezing it together, and it comes out something is extruded out by the yeast manufacturers and put into bags, and it can be stored for a couple of weeks in bags, again under chilling conditions. It has a consistency a little bit like crumbly cheese, and typically you can buy yeast in this form as a pressed yeast. Pressed yeast was introduced a good few years ago when yeast companies produced nothing else but yeast, and they wanted to keep it for a couple of weeks for transportation to either bakeries or distilleries. The last one then on the right is what we call active dry yeast. And this is quite crumbly. It's a little bit like breadcrumbs in consistency, but and it's dried and put into kind of a foil bags, and it's vacuum packed. And it can be stored for up to 2 years in this form. And this is very versatile. It's easy to handle. The pressed yeasts are prone, and cream yeast are prone to infections, because if you get dirt or anything like that in the fridge or in the tanks, you have a problem. But with dried yeast, you can literally open the bag and put it into your fermentation. Now, what they do recommend is, and probably the most the better way to handle it is to put it into some wort that's around 36 to 38 degrees, just to revive it. And then with some oxygen, it will multiply, and you can then start fermentation when the oxygen is used up. So on our next slide, we're looking at Dara here in the photograph on the right. Dara works with us in the distillery. He's my chief bottle washer. He won't like that word, but he's my assistant distiller. And here you can see Dara adding yeast into the fermentation vessel. It looks like a cream, but it is actually powder or a dried yeast, and that's the aluminium foil bag. And we weigh out our amount of yeast in there, and people will ask you, well, how much yeast? Well, that's what all that documentation on the left is about, all those figures. So for batch fermentation, which we're using here, you're using 6 by 10 to the power 6, which is 6 million yeast cells to 6 million to 10 to the power of 7 is 100 million, 10 million, 6 to 10 million cells per mil of wort. But easier than that is if you go right down to the bottom, you see we use 1 kilo of dried yeast per 1,000 liters of wort. And that's what we add to our fermentation to get things going. In the next slide, we're looking at alcohol production and yeast growth. Now, when yeast is growing, in other words, it starts off, as we said earlier, dry, and then it needs to grow and then bud. But the growing phase is the most important part for production of alcohol. If you look on the left there, it says growing cells produce alcohol 33 times faster than non-growing cells. So we want to get them in that growing phase. That's when most of the sugars are actually converted to alcohol, and that's what that top graph shows you. The first stage on that graph is what we call the lag phase. So if you're just putting in yeast into a sugar solution, it takes a few minutes for the yeast to realize what's going on, and that, oh, happy days, I'm in the soup, which is the sugar solution. And away we go. Then we start growing and converting our sugar into alcohol to do that. And then you get to a stage where it's at a stationary phase, and again, we're producing alcohol for the remainder of the time there. So that growing stage takes somewhere between after 5 hours up to 30 hours. The bottom one then is a bit more interesting because it shows you the time frame in relation to the production or the reduction in sugar. So if you start off as we do with glucose, which is that top line there, at about 80 grams per liter, you can see that as the time goes along, right on up to 96 hours, 100 hours, 120 hours, that most of the conversion is happening after the first maybe 5 or 6 hours, and then as it rapidly converts down to the 100-hour mark. So typical fermentations can be anything from 48 up to 120 hours. It's easier to get shorter fermentations if you have control on your temperature, because this is one of the areas where it's not necessarily the case that, you know, if that you want a long fermentation, because it produces different congeners in the spirit. So a shorter fermentation suits some people, but you don't always get the full yield in that respect as well. So you get more sweeter wort left at the end of fermentation. So on the next slide, we're going to look at the theoretical yield from and how yeast does, and not so much how yeast does, but what happens in fermentation. So if we take our starch molecule on the left there, or molecules, we've underneath the marker, you can see there are 90 units. So 90 units of starch, and this is coming from your barley or your malt or maize or whatever you use in fermentation. If it's starch and you're adding water, 10 parts of water, you will end up with 100 parts of glucose. And that's the chemical reaction of changing starch into sugar. You need water to do that. So you take your 100 units of glucose that you produce in your mashing, and you then convert it using yeast, and it will produce 51.1 units of ethanol and 48.9 units of carbon dioxide. This is what we call a mass balance. So 90 plus 10 gives you 100, 51.1 plus 48.9 gives you 100. So that's exactly the proportions that you should get in the theoretical yield of alcohol from a starch base. All right, so the next slide we're going to look at is the stress factors that we talked about in some detail earlier, but this puts them all on the one basic slide. This is our yeast cell in the middle, and all these little things on the outside are the ones that causes problems. So we start off with the pH on the top left there. So pH 3 to 4. So that's not good for the yeast. The yeast likes to be a little bit higher than that. The next one is lactic acid. Above 0.8% weight by volume will kill the yeast. So it's very important that we control that lactic acid bacteria. And the only way we can do that is by making sure that our fermentation vessels are sterile. And we do that mostly by cleaning the vessels after fermentation and or before we put the wort in. The wort will be sterile because it's been up at about 70 degrees anyway before it comes down to 28. And then the yeast, we have to make sure we don't introduce anything that's going to create a problem with the yeast. So the actual dosage of yeast is important, that that's done properly and cleanly. And then we won't have a problem with lactic acid. If you skip across to the next one, you can see the sugar content. It should be 1 to 2% in early fermentation. But again, it can tolerate up to 38% weight by volume. But again, if you're outside or above these limits, you're in trouble and the yeast doesn't perform properly. The other one, we skip on to the ethanol one. It says 23% is possible. Very, very few people are producing alcohol by fermentation at 23%. You're probably looking at plants that are producing bioethanol, and not insofar as it's for use in cars or production like that. So the very high alcohol strengths can be achieved. And again, they're using things like genetically modified yeasts. Wouldn't be using an ordinary baker's yeast as such. So that can be done. But again, we run an alcohol content somewhere around about 8 to 11% alcohol in the power squirt setup. So that's my presentation on our yeast cells, and I see that we have just a few more minutes left here. So I'm going to go back to Caroline and see if there's been many questions coming in relation to fermentation, and try and answer those. Caroline.
Thanks. Thank you so much for that, Noel. Really detailed and lots for everybody there. And I think it really illustrates the expertise involved in the whole process. So lots of interest in the technical side of it and the chemical side, and a few questions in from Owen there. So the first one would be, when do you call the fermentation process completed? Are you measuring the SG or the ethanol content?
Good question. Well, we're monitoring the specific gravity, because that is equivalent to the alcohol content as well. But you have to be careful. If you have a lactic acid bacteria infection, you're not going to get down to the right specific gravity. So we're talking about fermentation starting somewhere about 1.07 and bringing it down to about 0.995. So alcohol is lighter than water, sugar is heavier than water. So your sugar solution at the start is heavier than water. As I mentioned, it's 1.07. And as alcohol increases, your gravity will drop and eventually goes below water when you have about 8 or 10% in the fermentation. It's a little bit more difficult to measure alcohol content in a beer. You will have to distill it, and that can take anything from half an hour to do, depending on the kit that you have. So it's much easier to measure the gravity and be aware of the alcohol content in that way.
Okay, and just following on from that, Owen was wondering if so the water purity is the key control, the key to controlling the sulfite and the sodium ion. So how do you control the vent of the CO2? Do you use scrubbers?
No, we don't. Fermentation, carbon dioxide is very, very clean. And unless you have a very big plant, you wouldn't use scrubbers to wash the CO2. And it's not normally done in a plant of our size at any rate. So we're looking at, and some people will actually collect that carbon dioxide for use in other industries, but we don't use scrubbers in power sport.
Okay, well, just one more from Owen, and then I have a few others there to get through. So, how do you monitor the mycotoxin in the grain that is in the RM?
Well, mycotoxins, these are the toxins
Yeah.
that they talk about coming in from grain, and that's actually controlled by the malting companies. They are very, very particular about what's in the grain, so that is measured by them. But we would also send our samples over to an analysis laboratory specifically for all kinds of things, but specifically for mycotoxins now and again. And the Department of Agriculture also would measure that in the spent grains that we are supplying to the farmers, and also this pot ale. But so we don't necessarily have any problems with those, but they are tested quite regularly by both the department and ourselves, just to make sure that those levels aren't there.
Great, okay. Sean was interested in the process of adding the yeast and the type of yeast required, and I think we cover that in detail, Sean, for you. There's another question there from Connor. So do you ever, or would you ever use lager yeast in fermentation? And what's the difference between brewer's yeast and distiller's yeast?
Well, with brewing, you have typically two basic standards for yeast. You have what we call a top fermenting yeast, and top fermenting yeast is typically used to produce a lager, and a bottom fermentation yeast is used to make a beer. So in distiller's yeast, we're looking for a bit of both. So the distiller's yeast would have the traits from both types of both strains, a top and a bottom, as kind of combined into a distiller's yeast, because you want to ferment everything out and we want it to be efficient and all the rest of it. So the best distiller's yeasts are typically a combination of both bottom and top fermentation styles. Of course, there are other yeasts, there's all kinds of yeasts available, and look at the wine industry, for example. Typically they would use the wild yeast that grows on the vine with the grapes, and they don't necessarily add yeast at all. So I mean, there's a variety of different things you have with yeast and yeast types.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. And then Noel, there's another question here from Noel Martin, actually. He was wondering where our water comes from. And in terms of, I think this actually feeds into a few questions we got from people on registration. Given your over 30 years experience, you'll have seen a lot of changes maybe in the process over the last number of years. So Noel's very interested in the technical changes as well. So maybe we'll start with the water and move on to the technical side of it.
Well, the water we're taking is from the Powerscourt estate. There is an aquifer underneath the estate, a massive big water reservoir really of in the rock, and we have a pump and well that brings that out. And it's a very high quality water. It's certified mineral water, and it makes a very good whiskey. As for fermentation technologies, well, way back, I would have mentioned earlier maybe that wooden fermenters were used because they didn't have a lot of steel or anything like that back in the 1800s or 1700s when that whole iron revolution took off. So typically they fermented in smaller barrel type vessels. And then the economies of scale that come with bigger distillation plants and all the rest of it, they moved up to big wooden fermenters. Wood is still used today in some fermentation and some distilleries, but more people, especially in the beer industry, moved over to stainless steel, and then that has taken on as well in the whiskey distilleries. Stainless steel is much easier to control. It's much cleaner. It's easier to maintain hygiene regimes in a stainless steel vessel than it would be with a wooden one. Now, a lot of people that have wooden vessels say how they steam them and all the rest of it, and they do, and it does work. And they say it gives it a different style or taste of whiskey. Fine, I don't have a problem with that, but I do find them a little bit more difficult to manage. And stainless steel is probably the way to go. It's also more difficult to manage the cooling because with a wooden fermenter, you typically would start off the fermentation at a lower temperature and just used maybe less yeast as well. So you don't have, you can have a longer fermentation time as a result. With stainless steel and with cooling jackets, you can increase the amount of yeast you're adding, and that gives you a shorter fermentation time because, again, you can control the temperature, and adding more yeast working in that shorter time frame, you can get a better efficiency. So other things then were in relation to the yeast, as I mentioned when we talked there about the different styles from cream to pressed to dried yeast. Dried yeast has only become more popular in the last 15 years or so. So those are the main changes in fermentation technology that I would see.
That's great. No, it's just the expanse of your career. You've seen so much, so it's great to get your grains of wisdom on it. We did get an email question in from Eric there yesterday, and Eric's joining us from Belgium for the last 3 weeks. So great to have you with us again, Eric. I think there's two parts to his question, and one is probably around how we maintain the consistency of our whiskey in the whiskey making process, and how we decide on making a different type of whiskey. Is it chicken and egg scenario, or do we actually set out to make a different type of whiskey? So I think you have we're precursors ourselves to the distillation, but you can go ahead on that one.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's one that comes up now and again, especially for a lot of distilleries that are out there using whiskey that, you know, we're all new distilleries starting up. We don't have our mature whiskey yet, and we're using whiskey that we've made somewhere else. Like for Cullen, 14-year-old, where Powerscourt Distillery itself was only started distilling in 2018. So the question is, how are you going to be confident that you're going to have a whiskey that's going to taste the same, even though it was made in a different distillery at a different time? There are various ways of managing that, and I've said on a number of occasions that if you could build two distilleries, one on either side of the road, almost identical or even identical, ultimately they could produce two different styles of whiskey. And there's loads of reasons for that. It's all down to the ingredients. You could be using peated malt, for example, is the simplest one of all. So if one's using malt and one's using peated malt, you have two different whiskies. The mash bill, pot still in particular, you have a different ratio between the grains. That's the first thing. All of the individual changes in temperatures and volume ratios. So if you have a higher wort content, I mentioned in the mashing process, if you have a bigger mash tun, you can produce a clear wort. Or, you know, there's so many variations within the process that you can tweak to give you a different style of spirit. So knowing all of those things is what you can do to manipulate the whole process to produce what you want. And if you know what you're doing, you have a much better chance of doing that. But again, when you get, the essence of quality control is minimizing the variations, and that gives you consistency. So you're using the same setup for the production process, you will end up with the same output. And then we have to go through distillation, so different techniques in distilling. and then the different wood that you can put the spirit in to give you even again a different flavor and style in maturation. And we'll come on to those two topics in the next couple of webinars. And when you do get your whiskey produced, you again go into blending, and that's a whole art in itself, which we will discuss at a later stage as well. But that's how you can use all of the tools that you have to get a flavor that you're interested in or a style.
So just one more question in there from Bianca. And hi, Bianca, great to have you with us again this evening. Is the fermentation process the same for pot still and malt whiskey?
Effectively, yes. The adjuncts that you're putting in other words, like a malt or barley, doesn't really affect fermentation in any way. So, yes.
Okay. Cahill wants to know, he said, I've read that the lactic acid may add certain desirable flavors in a fermentation, particularly at the end. Is this the case?
Absolutely. I mean, all of these things, what we were talking about in the presentation there, were what causes stresses. And stresses, if your lactic acid gets high, it gives you a different outcome. And these things can be either desirable or undesirable depending on what you want as a distiller.
Okay, great. Colm is wondering, how does the water quality affect the final product?
Well, again, when we discussed ingredients, I would have said if you have, we take extremes, that's the best way of doing this. You say if you went out into the drain in the back garden there and pulled the water out of that from the sewer, you're not going to make nice whiskey out of that. So, you know, that's an extreme. But you go on, then you take river water, for example. It's a surface water. So you will have everything in that that's coming off the fields. And that could be anything from manure that has been used for farming and for tillage and for growing grass, for example. So, but again, you will have very clean water in rivers, and you have the fish will live in there, so it's quite good. But certain things you need to know about water, that if the water quality is good, you do need some salts in there, you do need some other ingredients in the water, and once you know that, you can and you know what's in the water that you have available to you, you can either treat it or you can add or take away some of those. For example, yeast requires a minimum of kind of like 50 parts per million of calcium in the water. So if you have a very, very soft water, the yeast would do better if you had some more calcium in there. Similarly, sodium or sulfates in the water don't help. You need to know what they are, and in that way you can control your fermentation and other flavors and whatever you want. Again, people would have said that using peated water from a bog will give you a peaty flavor. So, you know, all of these things have an influence. It's just knowing which ones you want.
That's great, Noel. And time has beaten us again. Lots of interesting questions this evening, and we're actually coming up to nearly the 40 minutes. So I just wanted to thank you. I know I certainly learned a lot this evening. I'm sure everyone has, and there's lots of substance to really get your teeth into there, whether you're at the beginning of your whiskey journey or indeed many years along and enjoying gathering all of those grains of wisdom. So just remains for me to say again, you know, thank you for joining us this evening, and tonight's webinar will be available on our YouTube channel over the next few days. Do join us on all our social media platforms, and if you have any questions in advance of next week, we'll be covering distillation. Please do email them in, and we'd be delighted to add them on to chat. We will be having a full tasting session in the next few weeks. I think it's about the 16th of May. So plenty of time to get your orders in online for our trilogy pack, and we can get them out to you. We're also running some competitions on our Instagram and Facebook pages for you to win some packs as well. So we'd be delighted for you to join us, and we hope you're all enjoying a sip of the Ishkabaha this evening, and we just want to wish you all the very best. Stay well and stay safe, and Slán. You can't forget that.